On that autumn night, Helen stayed up late in the kitchen, repeatedly looking at family photos. She couldn't hold back the tears. Almost all the pictures showed her with her husband, Julio. In one, the young couple was hugging at the cinema, and in another, they were relaxing by the river. Julio and Helen had met during their last year of university and felt an immediate attraction to each other. It was that kind of fateful meeting that only happens once in a lifetime. None of their friends doubted that they would soon become an official couple after graduation. After buying a small house on the outskirts of the city and moving in together, they held a small wedding ceremony. Now, nothing stood in the way of the young family's happiness. They could enjoy life together, full of love and mutual respect. Julio, as the head of the family, soon secured a good job, which allowed the newlyweds to start thinking about having children. First, they had a son named Eduardo, and 2 years later, a daughter named Melissa. Since Julio spent most of his time at work, the responsibility of raising the children fell entirely on Helen's shoulders. However, despite being busy with household chores, the young mother remained in good spirits and considered herself a happy person. Meanwhile, Julio's career took off, leading to an increase in their income. The family's fortunes steadily improved over time. They moved into a better house and even bought a new car. It seemed as if the young family's life was perfectly planned out for the coming years, with only success and prosperity awaiting Julio and Helen in the near future. However, their happiness was short-lived, and now, as Helen flips through the family photos in the kitchen, she can't stop thinking about that fateful day once again. That morning, Julio had breakfast with his family, as he always did, and after kissing his wife and children, he headed off to work. Around midday, he called from his office to let Helen know that he would have to stay late due to some changes in management at his company. The firm was going through some transitions, and he needed to adjust to the new bosses. In some of their conversations, Helen gathered that the new director was a woman, though she wasn't entirely certain. Since Helen was always busy with family matters and knew how hard her husband was working, she decided not to bother him with unnecessary questions. After preparing Julio's favorite dinner, Helen waited for him to return from work, frequently glancing at the clock on the wall. To pass the time, she played with their children, Eduardo and Melissa. They loved doing puzzles, but this time, they couldn't manage without their mother's help. Time passed, but Julio still hadn't come home. The young businessman wasn't answering his phone, and when Helen called his office, she was told that he had left for a business meeting. Trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening, Helen comforted herself with the thought that her husband's phone might have simply run out of battery and that he would call or come home at any moment. Unfortunately, Helen's concerns weren't taken seriously at the police station. There are countless possibilities of where your husband might be. Maybe he lost track of time with some friends at a bar, or perhaps he took a lover to Miami. Wait a few days, and we'll file a missing person report if he doesn't show up, the officer on duty told her. But Helen knew that Julio would never abandon her or their children for some mythical lover. When it became clear that her husband was truly missing, Helen returned to the police station. Unfortunately, an extensive search yielded no results. Julio seemed to have vanished into thin air without a trace. 2 weeks later, Helen received the devastating news that her husband's car had been found in the river, but the body of the young businessman was never recovered. In the car, Helen continued to believe that her husband was still alive. The vehicle had been discovered by some fishermen, and now the likely cause of the young businessman's death became clear. He was probably in a hurry to get to his business meeting and must have lost control of the car, crashing through the protective barriers and ending up in the river. After the car was pulled out, a diver searched the riverbed, but they didn't really expect to find Julio's body. "There's a very strong current here, ma'am. The body could have easily been carried hundreds of kilometers away from the accident site," one of the divers said, with a sad sigh. Yet Helen continued to believe her husband was alive, even when everyone else had accepted Julio's death. During this time, Eduardo and Melissa kept asking their mother when their dad would come home. Hiding her tears from her children, Helen made up stories about their father going on a long business trip to one of the European countries. "Wow, he's going to see Paris and London," exclaimed Eduardo, unable to hide his excitement. "Yes, dear, and he also promised to send you gifts," Helen replied, barely holding back her tears. She decided to send gifts to her children in their father's name, as Julio couldn't officially be declared dead yet. "I prefer the children to remember him as he was the last time they saw him," Helen thought, tears welling up in her eyes. As the years went by, taking care of the children consumed much of her time and energy, preventing her from falling into depression and giving up on life. Their joyful laughter and playful outdoor activities were like a healing balm for Helen's tormented soul. Although she now considered herself a widow, she still couldn't allow another man into her heart, subconsciously believing that one day her husband would return and things would go back to normal. Throughout this time, Helen managed to support herself by taking on random freelance jobs she found on an online platform. However, as Eduardo and Melissa grew older, Helen needed more money to provide them with at least the basics. So, after browsing through the job search website once again, she decided to change careers. Helen had to carefully sift through hundreds of job offers before finding something truly worthwhile. They're looking for a worker for a country house, and the pay is guaranteed, Helen read slowly, repeating the ad several times. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that it was the perfect opportunity for her. "Good pay, that's exactly what I need," Helen exclaimed. Helen picked up the phone and dialed the number from the ad. Within the first few minutes of the conversation, she discovered that the owner of the house was a wealthy woman named Karina Rice. After going over all the details, Helen was satisfied with the terms of the job and agreed without a second thought. The next morning, she found herself standing in front of the gates of an impressive estate, surrounded by a high fence. At the center of the property stood a 3-story mansion with a red-tiled roof, massive columns, and numerous terraces designed as observation decks. Following the guard, Helen realized she was in a real castle. Finally, the man led her inside, and Helen entered the homeowner's office. "Hello, Helen. You look exactly as I imagined. I think you'll enjoy it here," Karina said with a smile, extending her hand to the new employee. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm sure you won't regret hiring me," Helen replied confidently. "I'm sure I won't. As you can see, we have a great team here. No one has ever complained about Michael, though unfortunately, my manager is running late. But no matter, you'll meet him later. In the meantime, feel free to explore the house and start your tasks," Karina said, making it clear that the conversation was over. Eager to follow her employer's instructions, Helen immediately dove into her new responsibilities. The house was incredibly large. In addition to Helen, Karina Rice employed a team of cooks, gardeners, guards, and a private driver. Everything was overseen by a manager named Michael, whom Helen had yet to meet. While she was polishing the windows, Helen noticed a car pulling into the driveway. "That must be the manager," she thought, continuing with her work. But when a fit young man stepped out of the car, Helen's hands froze and the sponge and bucket fell to the floor. "Julio? It can't be," she whispered, ignoring the water spreading rapidly beneath her feet. When the manager entered the house and saw the soapy puddle on the floor, deep wrinkles appeared on his forehead. "You're the new employee, right? My name is Michael. I'll let this slide this time, but I need to ask you not to let it happen again," he said in a cold tone. His words made Helen feel very uncomfortable. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded and looked away. Is it really Michael? But how is this possible? Oh God, he has that almost imperceptible scar on his upper lip, just like Julio, Helen thought, as the memory of her husband flashed through her mind. Meanwhile, the manager continued to act as if everything was perfectly normal, as if nothing unusual was happening at all. Seeing Helen for the first time in his life, or so he thought, Michael seemed unfazed. "All right, now is not the time. I'll talk to him later," Helen reasoned, gathering her strength. She spent the rest of the day doing chores around the house, which was full of work, and by the evening, she was utterly exhausted. Throughout the day, her mind kept drifting back to Julio, who was pretending not to know her. On a few occasions, Helen even witnessed Karina and the manager sharing kisses, clearly indicating a relationship between them. Finally, finding the right moment, Helen approached Michael in the courtyard and told him everything. She explained that they had known each other before and that they had 2 children who had been left fatherless. Needless to say, this revelation shocked the young manager. After overcoming the initial disbelief, he asked, "Ma'am, are you sure you're not mistaken? 5 years ago, something happened to me. I was found on the street with a head injury. Karina did everything to ensure I survived and even helped me obtain new documents. And now you're telling me my name is Julio." Looking into Helen's eyes, the manager realized she wasn't lying. Additionally, the large scar on the back of his head confirmed the truth of her words. But Helen hadn't waited 5 long years for her husband to return, only to give up without a fight. She wasn't about to let him go. Taking out her old phone, Helen began showing Julio pictures that served as undeniable proof of their life together. Just 3 photos were enough for the young manager. He clutched his head and sank to his knees with a groan, as images from the past spun frenetically in his mind, aligning into a coherent timeline of his previous life. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me.